right, welcome, and thanks for joining us for this afternoon's tips and tricks session on Enterprise PDM. My name is Jeff Girardi, and I've been specializing in PDM implementations for the last 4 years or so. I currently manage our PDM service delivery team, among some other job duties. And so in this session, we'll be looking at two of the new and highly anticipated functions introduced into Enterprise PDM 2013. The parallel transition workflow object, as well as the version-free variables, and we'll explore some best practice use case scenarios for each of those two new objects. This session, of course, is open to anyone who signed up and registered, but it's best suited for EPDM administrators who might be interested in implementing one of these new objects, and or power users who may have some influence over how the system is set up and configured to function in your company. With all that, let's go ahead and get started. So the concept of a parallel approval workflow has certainly been around for much longer than the workflow transition type of the same name. In a parallel approval, that's when multiple users are required to sign off on a given file before it actually gets approved. But the approvals don't necessarily have to happen in a particular order as they do in a serial approval process. For expedience, we would implement a parallel approval workflow to allow approvers from various groups to sign off on a file in any particular order, i.e. we don't have to wait for quality to sign off first before manufacturing signs off, and certainly that can lead to a lot of delays. So let's consider really two different workflow scenarios where parallel workflow approvals might be used. So in the first, we require one approver from each department, and every department must approve. Okay? And I'll call that the parallel department approvals. The second one to consider is when we require a certain number of approvals, or X number of approvals, from a larger pool of potential approvers. Okay? So in the first case, each group, engineering, quality, manufacturing, compliance, sales, whoever, they may have multiple individuals that are capable of signing off for that department, but only one sign-off is required per department. Okay. In the second scenario, right, I've got a group of approvers, and I just need at least 4 of them. Okay. Doesn't matter which 4 necessarily, but I need at least 4 out of my potential, 6 approvers. So I need a minimum X number of votes in order for the given file to be approved. Of course, there could even be hybrids between the two models, whereby I need 3 users from engineering and 1 user from quality and manufacturing and compliance and et cetera. We'll take a look at one of those examples later in the session as well. So using the traditional methods for enabling parallel workflows in EPDM, the two styles require slightly different setups. To get an appreciation for what the parallel transition object gives us, let's first take a look at those traditional methods that we've had to use in the past for enabling a parallel workflow. So we'll start out by reviewing what it takes to actually implement the parallel workflow using this traditional method. There's really 6 main requirements in order to succeed with this. The first is that we actually need a temporary workflow state. Okay, since we're performing some transitions, we're evaluating who is signed off, and then we're either pushing it on to approved or looping it back up to wait for more sign-offs. So the first thing that we need to introduce is a temporary workflow state. The next thing that we need to have is one transition per approval. Okay, so we need one transition for the engineering department, we need another transition for the quality approval, another transition for the manufacturing approval, so on and so forth. And to go along with that, okay, we need a data card variable to capture each approval. Okay, so when we do our our evaluations and we find out how many people have already signed off, how many people still need to sign off, we do that by using the data card variable values. So we'll need one for engineering approval, one for quality approval, so on and so forth. Then we need two different automatic transitions, one to automatically approve files, and then the other to automatically loop the files back up to the pending status. And which route it takes is going to depend on a set of transition conditions. Okay? So when we're looping them around, we're looking for transition conditions based on those variable values where the values are blank. If one of the values is blank, then let's loop it back around up to the pending status. Or if all of the values are not blank, then we'll automatically cycle it through to approved. So let's take a closer look at how I have this set up in my actual workflow. So by going into the administration tool, I've got that example that we were just looking at here, where I have my temporary workflow state. I've got my various approvals for the different departments, my two automatic transitions, and let's take a look at how I have this set up. So for the engineering approval, one of the things that we need to know is that only the engineering group is permitted to perform this transition. Okay, I don't have any. Any of the other groups allowed to perform this transition. If I look at the actions that I'm taking here, I'm doing a set variable action, and I'm setting the approval engineering variable. So you can see in my variables, I've actually got a variable for engineering, manufacturing, quality, sales, and I prefix them all with approval. So that is just one strategy to make it easy on the administrator to go back and select or group common types of variables. And then I'm filling out that variable value with the user data field. In a few minutes, we'll come back around and see why I choose to use the user data field instead of one of the other user fields like initials or login name or things like that. So I've got all of those set up for each of my different departments. So here in quality, we can see that the quality users are the only ones permitted to perform that particular approval. Then they get sent into the approval temporary state where the automatic transitions evaluate them. Now here, it's important that we have our conditions set up. So in this case, in order for it to be approved, I want it to go to the approved state once all of the fields have values in them. So approval compliance is not equal to blank, and approval engineering is not equal to blank, and approval manufacturing is not equal to blank, so on and so forth. Okay. If I look instead at my loop transition here, and look at the conditions here, you can see I've got an OR condition set up, which says if the approval compliance is equal to blank, or the engineering approval is equal to blank, or the manufacturing approval is equal to blank, if any of those conditions are true, then we're going to loop it back up here to the department approvals and wait for other folks to sign off. The last thing that you'll notice I've done here is I've selected my icons. Okay, so in our workflow states, we can select our icons. And the icon is actually the icon that the user sees when they do the right-click change state action. So it makes sense to assign them accordingly. If I'm approving something, I'll put a check mark there. If I'm rejecting something, I'll put a red X, for example. So that's our basic setup for the traditional department-based parallel approvals. Now, in terms of how we use these, this is what the end user is going to see. In the department-based parallel approval process, you're going to see one approval for every department which you are permitted to approve for. So if I'm a member of both engineering and quality, I would see both those departments that I could potentially approve for. With the other parallel approval strategy, the minimum X number, I'm only going to see one option for approval. And what I have to do is I have to use some additional logic in the workflow to figure out which path it follows. So if we now look at the minimum X approvals method, it's structured pretty similarly to the department approvals method, but instead of using group permissions to determine which transition gets taken, we're going to need to add some additional transition conditions to get this sorted out. Okay, so same primary requirements as the other style, but we've added some additional conditions here. So let's take a look at how this would be implemented in the system. So I'll go to my next approval style here in my workflow, and I've got the three basic components so far, my pending state, here's my temporary approval state, and then my ultimate final approved state. Now, the first thing that I need to do is set up the transitions here. So in my workflow editor, I'll right-click, create a new transition from minimum X approvals, the pending state, into my temporary approval state. And I'll call this one approve. Now, in this case, rather than using the permissions to determine who can perform this transition, I'm actually going to add all of the various groups that can participate. So I'll select all those folks there, and I'll click Permit to allow them each to potentially approve this file. Okay. Similarly to the transition actions that we took with the department approvers, I have to capture who's doing this approval. So I'll set up a new action, and it's going to be a set variable action. And this time, instead of using the department approvers that I had down here, since we don't know which user is approving for which department, all we need is X number of approvers. It doesn't matter who they're from. I've got some different variables set up here. In this case, approvals 1 through 5. I'll take the same action here and set the value to the user data field. And I always leave a comment so that I remember what I've done when I go back to modify this in the future. So set approver 1. Okay. I can then use this when determining which files, which transition paths to take. Okay. The other thing that I need to do here, and this is how it's different from the other process, is I need to put in a condition so that it knows which approval step to go through. So in this case, it's going to use this approval 1 if the approval 1 value is empty, the approval 2 value is equal to empty, and the approval 3 value is equal to empty. Okay? Then it will automatically go down this path. Okay, I'm going to set up another transition here. I'm going to call it the same thing, assign the same permissions, okay, engineers, manufacturing, quality, allow them to perform that. The action, I'm going to set up a similar action. Instead of setting up approval 1, though, this time I'm going to set my variable on approval 2 using the user data field. And my conditions are going to be slightly different. So this time, it's going to go through this transition when approval 1 contains some value. Remember that the % sign is our wild card when evaluating conditions. So the approval 1 contains some value. Approval 2 is equal to blank, and approval 3 is equal to blank. Okay, so then the system will automatically know to go through this transition and fill out the approval 2 data if approval 1 already has a value. And then I would repeat this process for X number, however many number of parallel approvals I need. One other thing that I want to bring to your attention is you do have the ability to copy and paste transitions in your workflow. So you can right-click on the transition, copy it, right-click again in the open space in your workflow editor and say paste, and it will prompt you to select the source state and select the destination state. And this copies not only the transition, but it already grabs my permissions, it grabs any conditions that are here, it grabs the actions that are here. So I just have to come in and modify the actions as appropriate. So change the action and change the conditions such that they're now valid for this. Saves me a little bit of time and reduces my ability to make errors here. Now, I told you I'd go through and tell you why I use that user data field. So if I open up my users library, and I'll just select myself here, we've got a couple of fields here that we can use when referencing a user in EPDM. We can use their login name, their full name, their initials, their email, or the user data field. Now, I like to use the user data field, and I use it almost as a drawing name, if you will, because oftentimes our login names are tied to Active Directory maybe, or they may have lowercase characters. Certainly the full name contains spaces and lowercase characters. And on the face of our drawing, if I'm mapping these values back to a title block somewhere, I want them to comply with our drawing standards. So the user data field gives you the flexibility to define a user identifier in compliance with your drawing standards. In my case, first initial dot last name, all caps. So that's why I like to use the user data field. It's kind of a free field that we can tie back to our user when filling out values in the workflow and things like that. So some of the advantages of using these parallel transition methods is, of course, the approvals happen in parallel. So we're not waiting on a user like we would be in a serial process, and which could potentially be holding up work and causing unnecessary delays. Second advantage of using this parallel transition method is we can actually capture on the data card, or recording on the data card, who has approved the file, either for a given department or in terms of number of users. And using attribute mapping in our variables, that information can be pushed into custom properties and show up on our title block if that's where we need it. We can also, at the same time, if we build in a reject option there as well, we can take an action to clear out all of those users and start again. On the flip side of that, it can take considerable time to set up and configure properly, especially as the number of departments or number of users required to sign off grows. And that also means that it's difficult to modify as you scale the system up to meet the needs of your company going forward. The other disadvantage to this method is that we actually have one file version created every time that somebody approves this, since we're actually modifying the metadata properties, which results in a new file version each time it goes through an approval. Instead, let's take a look at those same two scenarios, but this time using the new parallel transition workflow object that was introduced in EPDM 2013. And in fact, this parallel transition type is actually well suited for either scenario, as well as that hybrid model that we referenced a few minutes ago. So we accomplish this using the new tools by introducing a new concept in the overall permission schema called a role. Now the roles are only available when you select the parallel transition as a transition type, and they allow you to define how many users must approve the file before the transition is allowed to complete. So looking at this workflow that I've got on the screen, it actually provides for the exact same release process as the one in our previous example, but in this case there's only two requirements: the parallel transition type and transition roles. So much simpler from an administrative perspective. Okay, the parallel transition type is actually identified with a double line arrow and a green check mark next to the transition name. The roles themselves allow us to define how many users from each role are required to sign off, and then which users are a member of which role. So let's take a look at exactly how that happens in the workflow editor. So if I come over here to my new parallel approval process, we can see that I just have my one pending state, my single transition, and it goes straight to the approved state. No need for a temporary approval state. If I look at the properties of this transition, we can see that when I select the parallel type, okay, I get a new field up here. I still have my permissions, conditions, actions, revision numbers. I still have all the same fields that I have in the other two transition types, but now I have one called roles. And when I go ahead and add a role to this transition, maybe I'll add a role for well, let me go ahead and remove my engineering role and re-add it here. So I'll create a new role called engineering, and then I say how many users from this particular role are required to sign off. And maybe I'd say we can leave it at one user, and this would be the equivalent of the department work approval method. Or I could say 4 users, and this would be the equivalent of the minimum X method. Or I can say you know, a handful of users and add additional roles, and that's actually a hybrid model where I'm requiring a certain number of users from various groups or various roles. So once I define this role, I can add members, and I can select members individually if I'd like, or I can just take my engineering group and say that anyone in my engineering group is a valid signer for the engineering role in this particular transition. And I can require, say, 3 users from engineering. So in this case, we can see that there are 5 potential users as members of this role, but only 3 of them are required. Similarly, in sales, there are 8 people in the sales role, but only one of those 8 is going to be required to sign off in this approval. So we can see that it's actually quite simple to set up this either the department method, the minimum X method, or a combination of those 2 methods all into a single transition, so we're not having to write workflow conditions, we're not having to use special permission schemes. We can manage that all here through the use of roles. So when we use this for the end user, you're only going to see a single transition option, and you're also going to see the number of current approvals and the total number of approvals needed. Okay, so in this case, I have 0 current approvals for this file, and there are 8 approvals required. So once I actually click on this change state action and essentially vote to approve this file, I can now see that there's 1 vote for this file for approval, and there are 8 total required. Once you've completed your state change action, you also have the ability to revoke your approval, basically take it back, and you can do that all the way up to the point until we get 8 of 8 approvals in this case. So once we have all the required number of users that have approved, the state change action is complete and it actually goes to approved automatically. So comparing the various methods, the new method and the traditional method, there's certainly merits to both in terms of implementing a parallel approval workflow. If you have requirements that you need to capture all the approvals' electronic signatures, write their names to respective custom property values, and display them in the drawing title block, then you're fairly tied to the traditional method, as that's going to allow us to capture the user data for each individual sign-off. However, if your processes permit that those records be maintained in the PDM system itself and not on the face of the drawing, then I'd strongly encourage you to make use of the parallel transition type in the workflow, as there's significantly reduced administrative overhead and it's very scalable for future growth and future modification. So let's switch gears a little bit and take a look at the capabilities of the often requested version-free variables. Okay, this is one of the #1 requests I've heard from customers, is they want to be able to change metadata values without affecting the file version. So when might one consider using a version-free variable? These types of variables are really best suited for values that change frequently without impacting the geometry or integrity of the model. And they're also values that do not require mapping to file custom properties, i.e. they're not used in the title block for your drawing. They're commonly used for reference only, to display values that may be controlled by other systems or processes, but are maybe convenient to associate with a file. So for example, cost or preferred manufacturer, they're values that when they change, they don't really necessitate a new version of our file. So this new type of variable does not require users to be able to check out the file in order to modify it. However, it does come with a new set of permissions that need to be set and that administrators need to be aware of. So let's take a look at how we would go ahead and define a version-free variable in the system. We do so through the variable editor, as we would any other variable. So notice that when I define a variable as version-free by marking that checkbox, I don't have any options to map to file attributes. And that's because when we map a file attribute back to a custom property, for example, we are actually physically changing the file, and by rule in a PDM system, that necessitates that a new version of the file be created. Okay, that's the whole point of tracking design history changes. So the second thing that you'll notice there is I have an option to allow the version-free variable to update all versions of the file with a new value, or just the latest version of the file. So the difference between these two options is that when selecting all versions, whenever you retrieve an earlier version of the file, the current value from your version-free variable will be displayed. So when selecting the latest version, though, that value is only applied to the latest version of the file, and earlier versions of the file may display a different value, or whatever value of that variable was current at the time that the last version was saved. So there's a couple of things to consider when regarding version-free variable behavior that are important to note. So the first is that version-free variables cannot be mapped to custom properties. Okay. The next consideration is that users require both folder permission and state permission to be able to edit a version-free variable value. So similar to our checkout permissions, where we have to assign them both at the folder level and at the state level. Again, we have to do the same with our ability to edit version-free variable data. So this is that new permission that I was referring to earlier. The next consideration is that if a version-free variable is actually updated as part of a workflow transition action, okay, it's going to result in a new file version, even if it's the only value that gets updated by the action. So whenever we have the workflow automatically filling out information in our data card or updating our values, even if they're version-free variables, will still result in a new version of a file. So that's the same as it works today with normal variables. So just to be aware of that. Finally, when it comes to file history, the file history does actually maintain a log of when the variable was modified, who it was modified by, but it doesn't contain any record of its previous value. Okay, so in terms of searching on previous values or looking through the history to see what the value used to be, we're not going to be able to have access to that information. The only thing captured in history is that somebody changed the value of that version-free variable. Okay. So those are really the considerations for use there. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon, getting a better insight into how to best implement parallel workflows and use version-free variables. I'll stay on the line for a few more minutes to answer any questions that may come up in the questions window or in the chat window. Or you can feel free to email me with any questions, and I'd be happy to follow up with you as well. Thanks.